Hi everyone, welcome to the Climate Confident podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guests, Denise and Tina. Denise and Tina, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourselves with maybe Tina going first, seeing as Denise has been here before?
Oh, thank you. My name is Tina Fawcett, and I'm a senior researcher and associate professor at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford.
Okay, Denise?
Hi, yes, I'm Denise Baden. I'm Professor of Sustainable Business at the University of Southampton.
Fantastic. And we are having a conversation today about the topic of personal carbon allowances. So this is something that has been talked about for quite a while, but maybe, Tina, would you like to dig in first and explain to people who might be unaware what are personal carbon allowances? What's the idea of personal carbon allowances?
So, the idea of personal carbon allowances is finding a way of reducing national and global carbon emissions in a way that's fair and in a way that engages people so that people are involved in this society-wide reduction we've got to make. And there are different variants of the idea, as you might imagine, for something that a number of people have worked on. But the basic idea is that within a national carbon cap, each individual would get an equal share of carbon emissions, let's say for their household energy use and transport energy use, and maybe their consumption of food as well. And when you purchased a product or a service that involves carbon, not only would you pay the money, you'd have to pay in sort of carbon points or carbon units throughout the year. And if you spent less than your allowance, you'd have a sort of spare carbon, a set of carbon allowances you could sell to somebody. And if you spent more, you'd need to acquire more carbon allowances. So it's a way of sharing out the carbon cap.
Okay. And is it fair?
I think it's more fair than some of the alternatives. I mean, there's always this question about if you give people an equal allowance, people's needs can be really quite different. So if you think about household energy use, actually if you live in a household on your own, you need to heat all your space. Whereas if one other person moves in with you, let's say you'd have two carbon allowances, but you wouldn't use that much more energy as two people than you do as one. So there are some issues around giving people equal allowances for sure, but it's fundamentally saying we've got this limited resource, which is the amount of carbon we can emit into the atmosphere before we cross really dangerous planetary boundaries. And we're going to give each person an equal share of that. And of course, in practice, that means some people will have to do more than others. Some people will find it more difficult than others to live within a sort of carbon, within that carbon budget. But it seems to me you're starting from a point of, in principle, it's fair. In practice, of course, it will have different consequences depending on people's lives and the societies they're living in.
Okay. And is this, I'll come to you in a sec, Denise. I can see you're ready to jump in there. I just want to clarify this again, Tina. Is this the same idea as the EU ETS, as in carbon markets? Just carbon markets give large companies carbon allowances that they can purchase or sell, and they then decide how to work with those allowances or permits that they have, and they can trade them. They're day traded every day, about 4 billion a day. Is that the same kind of idea, just scaled down to individuals?
I mean, I would say yes and no. Yes, in that the idea is the way you're going to reduce carbon emissions is you're going to set a cap, which is going to reduce over time. You're going to distribute the allowances under that cap, and there's going to be a way of trading them or exchanging them. But in other ways, it's really quite different, because the way that EU ETS has worked up to now is mostly around, it's a sort of grandfathering system. So depending on companies get given allowances depending on what their current, carbon emissions were. And, it's quite well known that the EU ETS, certainly in earlier phases, there was a lot of so-called hot air, a lot of emissions that were somewhat notional. There's a lot of debate as to how effective the scheme has really been in terms of driving investment into low carbon energy and low carbon options. So I think I'm a bit reluctant to draw a comparison with that, because this is fundamentally about engaging people with the climate issue, and it's saying it's not all your responsibility, but you have got some responsibility, and we're going to give you more information about your carbon emissions. We're going to set a social norm around what's normal in terms of consumption and sort of high carbon behaviours, and how those have got to change over time. And yes, there will be a price associated with that, because there has to be some buying and selling, because people's emissions are so very different at the moment. If you didn't allow any trading, it'd be very hard to set a cap that was meaningful. But I feel it's a much more social, it's much more collective than something like the EU ETS, and the market bit is only there as a sort of side effect. That's not fundamentally what it's about.
Okay, Denise.
Yeah, I like it, I guess, from the perspective of a consumer as well. So, and I think, and a lot of people probably can relate to this, as a greenie, you spend a lot of your time either feeling hugely guilty, for what you are consuming, and seethingly resentful at other people who don't seem to care. So you can add a bit of barbecue, everyone's stuffing their face with beef burgers, and you're looking on yearningly with your bean burger. Or they've come back from the Maldives, want to go before it sinks, and you come back from your walking holiday in the Lake District, which was very nice, actually. But do you know what I mean? I think we feel that what we can do won't make a difference. And if we try and do something, we're kind of constantly in that tension of you kind of taxing my green conscience, if we do carbon offsets, which are voluntary. And this idea of a personal carbon allowance, it just strikes me as so fair. You've all got your own allowance, and you can then adjust it. Yep. So you can think, okay, I've got a dog, that uses a lot of pet food. I can go to insect-based pet food, and then I can allow myself your beef burger. Or you can make your own trade-offs, knowing it's fair. Pretty well everyone I know either doesn't make any changes because they think, what difference can I make? Or they do and feel resentful, or they don't and feel guilty. And none of those are nice places to be psychologically. And none of them really, very few of them help the planet. So I do like personal carbon because I think it's really fair. And by making people responsible for their own carbon consumption, you then give businesses an incentive to invest. So there's so much technology we could be investing in. And there's so many different alternatives, such as, repairing or sharing economy. On-demand transport, great public transport. It's never really going to take off because it's always more convenient to have your own car. Whereas if you can really get rewarded for ditching that and going for public transport, suddenly the service will become so much better. So for me, it's the spillover effects I think could be really transformative in driving investment into low carbon products and services.
Okay. The idea of the personal carbon footprint is something that was, if I read correctly, invented by BP back in the day to kind of make us feel responsible and divert attention away from BP's responsibility or the fossil fuel company's responsibility by making us feel responsible. And in fact, in a lot of cases, when they did that, there wasn't much alternative anyway. So I know there are more alternatives now. You have EVs now, which weren't a thing back when the idea of the personal carbon footprint was invented. You've lots of things now. Solar is a lot cheaper now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But is this more of that?
I'd say it's the opposite because it's systemic. If you just had personal carbon offsetting voluntary, then yes. But by giving a personal carbon allowance to live within, it's a systemic solution that applies to everybody. So you said you were going to ask provocative questions.
I did.
But I would not say so. This is a systemic solution that will apply society-wide. It's a systemic solution that incorporates all individuals.
Yeah, I mean that BP thing. I've tried to follow this argument back about BP invented carbon footprints, and I don't think it's true actually. I mean, yes, they used that sort of language quite early, but I don't think that's true. And I know it's an argument that some sort of US environmentalists have picked up to try and sort of reflect back onto saying, well, actually, we need low carbon structures and infrastructure in place, and it's unfair to put all the responsibility on individuals. And I totally agree with that, but I don't think it's right to say that BP invented it and it's all a sort of it's a sort of greenwashing, it's a sort of misdirection sort of thing. I don't think that's the case at all. There was quite a big phase of a lot of reflection on personal carbon footprints. You can see that if you sort of look in the media and look at the number of stories, and then it sort of went away a bit, and it's kind of coming back a bit again now, actually, that sort of reflection back onto the personal. And I think that's partly because we've understood that some choices can only be made by individuals. So like, you choose how far and whether you're going to fly for your holiday, and that has a big carbon and climate effect. Whereas other things, of course, it's about what the government invests in. If there's no investment in public transport and you live in the countryside and your job's somewhere else, then yeah, maybe you are a bit stuck. So it's, we need to look at both. And if a government introduced or a city introduced personal carbon allowances, I mean, part of the demands from the citizenry would be, well, where are our low carbon options then? How are we going to do this?
Yep.
Where are you investing in rail services, or where are you investing in sort of cheaper insulation or whatever it is that people need to enable them to make the right set of choices? So I'm reluctant to go on the sort of it's all sort of infrastructure or it's all personal. I mean, clearly it's both to do what we need to do.
Okay, how practical is this idea? I mean, how would you measure? I mean, to your point, Denise, about the insect dog food versus dog food based on chicken versus based on salmon or based on beef, and I just picked those out because I have a couple of dogs, and I do look at the ingredients of them, but nowhere on the packaging does it say the carbon footprint of any of them. In fact, that's an issue, that's a completely separate issue altogether, which we could have another entire podcast on, because, and I've mentioned this on the podcast a few times, one of the things I've done is I've given up dairy. And so I use oat milk, Oatly oat milk in my coffee. And that says on the carton of Oatly that it's 45 grams CO2 per litre of Oatly oat milk, which is great. Or not. Maybe it's terrible. I don't know, because no other milk gives me the carbon footprint of a litre. So, it could be horrendous or it could be fantastic. And so, to that point, how practical is this to measure the carbon footprint of absolutely everything we do, track that, report it, and then have that tied against our personal carbon footprint?
Didn't Tesco say they were going to carbon footprint all their products a few years ago? And I think this was an issue way back when the idea was first floated in the early noughties. We didn't yet have technology, but we've come a long way since then. And there's loads of apps already that enable you to track carbon footprints. Tina, you probably know more about what's the latest on this.
Well, I think there's two answers to that. I mean, but one answer on that, actually listening to one of your earlier podcasts, the Commons one. I mean, the founder there was making quite an interesting argument that we're not 100% accurate if we're trying to add carbon emissions to products, but we can be 80% accurate, and maybe that's good enough, which is quite interesting. And quite a lot of these sort of expenditure apps which try to link to carbon take that kind of approach. So that's one thing, saying we don't need the precision of carbon labeling on products at the individual level, because that's incredibly information intensive. And in fact, Tesco gave up. I think they ended up carbon labeling about 200 products, and they thought they were going to do 40,000. Right. So, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult, and global supply chains keep changing and blah, blah, blah. So it's really difficult. I mean, the other answer is people like me would say, well, why don't we start with the easy stuff? So start with household energy use and transport, where actually it's very easy to know what the carbon impact of a particular journey is, or per kilowatt hour of a particular fuel, and then build out from that. So start with the stuff where it's easy and then get onto the other choices as well. So there's, two approaches to thinking about it.
Learning by doing, they call it, don't they?
Isn't there as well the whole question around privacy, and is that a concern, do you think, for something like this?
Well, I mean, I think it would be your data, and Nobody else would know. So you would have some sort of carbon account, right, which you would operate, I guess, via your mobile phone for nearly everybody. That's how they would choose to do it. But I mean, that data would only be shared with people you wanted to share it with. And the only thing you would need to do, let's say you'd run out of carbon allowance that year and you needed to pay an energy bill, well, then you'd have to buy extra allowances from somewhere, and probably your energy company would sell them to you, having bought them on the market from sort of low carbon emitting people. So I don't think it involves sharing a lot of personal information with anybody.
Okay, cool. What about people's perceptions of personal carbon allowances? I can see, just from reading the media and reading a lot of comments on Twitter or LinkedIn posts, a lot of people are already skeptical, more so in the US, of the idea of climate change anyway. Trying to foist something like this on top of people, I wonder how that would be perceived.
Depends how scared you are, doesn't it? So, I mean, I'm doing a project on climate anxiety at the moment, and the statistics about climate anxiety are staggering. I mean, the majority of young people explicitly have climate anxiety now, and many of them have this sort of suppressed dread. It was a statistic, and then my own son sort of came up with something, worried about having children. So once you're scared enough, whether or not you can, continue your lifestyle regardless, becomes less important than can I actually continue to exist on this planet in a sustainable, safe way. So I think it goes hand in hand with awareness. I think Europe is ahead of the curve than America in terms of awareness. Solutions that are systemic in nature are going to appeal to more collectivist cultures than individualistic cultures. So America's very individualistic, more so than Europe. So in a way, I can see it probably being tested out in other countries to gain some traction, perhaps, and some credibility before we can hope it might take off in the country where actually it would have the most impact of all. Tina, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. It's I mean, we with some other authors, we sort of wrote a piece and where we were sort of arguing that the sort of country where it would be most likely to succeed will be a sort of obviously wealthy countries, ones with sort of that are highly, where mobile phones and information technology, highly digitalized countries where there's very good information systems and people have got access to that, and also where there's a high degree of trust in government. So we've been speaking to a colleague from Singapore, and he keeps saying, well, Singapore would be ideal because there's a high level of trust in government. People are part of a sort of community, and people live quite highly digitalized, quantified lives. And he felt that that would be the sort of society where you could certainly trial aspects of it, that it would be a sort of policy that would fit with the kind of the way things are done nationally. Whereas I totally agree with Denise. I mean, the US is not where you'd start it. That is for sure. And maybe it wouldn't be necessary. I mean, the question is it the right sort of policy for a particular country? In the UK, we've done really well at reducing our carbon emissions nationally, but we're not on track to meet our net zero goal by 2050. So things have got to change, and we've got to find mechanisms to help us adopt lower carbon technologies, lower carbon lifestyles. And some of those can just only focus on the technology, but some of them have got to focus on the people and the communities and the ways of doing things. They're the things we're not going to do. The things thinking about sufficiency as well as efficiency. So, we can't just keep doing things the way we've done. It's taken us so far, but we're not on track to get where we need to be at the moment, and we've got to have sort of grown-up conversations about that.
Yeah. Do you see any politician who you think would grasp that nettle?
I wish David Miliband was back in politics. He was really on it. Maybe he could be persuaded to. I think he was one of the original supporters of it, wasn't he, Tina?
He was, yeah, that's right. I mean, that is a good question about the politics of it. And certainly the first time when back in the noughties, when we were myself and colleagues were trying to talk to people about it and we were talking to, in fact, NGOs as well, sort of like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, and talking to people about this idea, and did they think it was a good? And some of them did think it was good, and they also said, yeah, but it's really quite difficult. I mean, we're going to stick to the things that, because obviously there would be people who don't like the idea, and they thought it would be a bit problematic, but some of the things that make it difficult aren't a problem anymore. So like the technology has come along such a long way, you can't really argue that this couldn't be done technically. It would be, not very difficult really to do technically, and not very expensive to do technically. The question is, are we going to have a discussion about what kind of changes we're going to make and who's going to make them, or not? We're just going to keep muddling through and hope technology will save us. I mean, it's done an all right sort of job, but there's no indication that that's going to get us as far as we need to get to.
Sure. And Denise, I mean, one of the things you said was about getting the word out, because lots of particularly younger people have eco-anxiety. So how would we get the word out about the importance of doing something like this?
Well, one of the things I'm been involved in is the Green Storage Project, and the goal there is to embed climate solutions in books, films, plays, and so on. Because if you ask someone to read a dry report on personal carbon trading, or it's gonna be hard work. But if you embed it in a story, you can see how it affects all the different characters, and so you can live it. And it's actually a much more engaging way to get the word out. So I've just written a play which is based on my book, The Assassin, which is one of the short stories in No More Fairy Tales, Stories to Save Our Planet. And it imagines 8 people in a citizens' assembly debating climate solutions. And then there's a murder. So you've got the whodunit, which is a nice sort of bit to keep people engaged. But one of the solutions is personal carbon allowances. So you have the different characters, and they all come to it with different issues. They're all different people. So one of them, who struggles with money, he's going to be better off. I think it was said that 71% of those in lower income brackets would be better off under personal carbon allowances. The wealthy guy is less keen. The ones with climate anxiety are like, I'll give up what I want, just please take the fear away. I think this will. So you can see everyone's got their own agenda. It will affect people in different ways. People are worried about different things. So the play Murder in the Citizen's Jury and the story The Assassin, and it comes up in quite a few stories in No More Fairy Tales, Stories to Save Our Planet, approached in different ways. So for me, that's one way to engage the public in really understanding it as it would affect them, rather than understanding it from an academic perspective. But I think it also needs to get on the agenda of more politicians. And when I've spoken to them, not many actually really understand it. Mm-hmm. And if they do, they think, well, yes, this would be transformative. But is it politically palatable? But I think what they're underestimating is the level of fear. Right. So even if people aren't going on all about climate change, I think there is this, submerged dread and avoidance and denial, but we know there's something to avoid. We know there's something we're not thinking about, and it's the future because it's scary. And I do think someone with some courage and leadership to sell the idea might find there's, more public approval than perhaps they realised.
They'd be pushing an open door, you think?
I think so. I think you've just got to sell the idea and take some leadership on it, because I think people think we want this problem solved, and as long as we're all in it together, I don't mind. But so many of the things are so piecemeal and disconnected. This would be transformative across every level. It would steer business towards sustainable products. It would transform society. So of course it's not going to be as easy and as straightforward as just twiddling around with the tax rate, but the payoffs would be so much greater. And I think there might be a great big breathing out of relief. Oh, we'll moan about it, but thank God actually someone's doing something.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of Singapore doing it, I can see. The government there has a lot more control over people's lives than many other governments. It's a tiny country, though. I mean, something like this needs to happen a lot more broadly than just the city-state of Singapore, no?
Yeah, for sure. And the question has always been, how would you, if you wanted to do this, how do you build the case, right? How do you get the evidence to show that actually we think it would be really effective because we think it gives people information, feedback, social norms, all this kind of academic theorizing around why this policy should be really powerful and a lot better than, say, a carbon tax, and a lot fairer than a carbon tax. But we don't know for certain. And so, one way is if somewhere like Singapore would adopt it. Another way might be to say, okay, let's use this just for one sector. So people have talked quite a lot about flying and the idea of having something like a frequent flyer levy, or you could go, or a flying allowance. Rather, we sort of tax flights somewhat at the moment, although not nearly as much as other forms of travel. But you could maybe pick one sector where it's very clear that it's the rich who fly and not the poor. And if you were going to have some sort of mechanism in flying, for certain it would be progressive, right? So it's the people who are creating the greatest sort of climate impact would be the people who would be disadvantaged under a policy like that, and the people who are not impacting the climate would be rewarded for that. So that might be another way of thinking about how could we try this idea out, because I think flying's a bit unique in the sense of there's no real magic technology coming along in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years that can give us, the same access to flying with sort of very low carbon emissions. It's not like electric vehicles, and it's not like switching to low carbon electricity or renewables. It's, it's a long way in the future if we ever get there. So that, it might be that you pick something like that.
I would love that idea. I would extend it to travel, though, because
Okay.
I do think the solution is not just everyone to switch to EVs. I mean, we don't have enough lithium in the world, and getting it out is no picnic. So
There's loads of lithium in the world. That's not going to be an issue. Seriously,
Yeah.
if you look at the numbers, there's loads of lithium. In fact, they just found a new, don't know what the word is, a new load of lithium in America,
We've got some in
was it in
Cornwall
Nevada,
as well.
somewhere like that.
But it's not
So-
a pretty business taking it out from under the sea or from mining. It's not a clean business.
True, it's not, but it displaces mining oil and petroleum, and the amount that you have to extract to make the batteries for EVs is insignificant in terms of the amount that you have to extract for oil and petrol and diesel. It's something like for fossil fuels, you are extracting, I can't remember the numbers now, but it's something like 365 times more resources from the soil than you are for EVs. So, no, that the lithium thing, it's not an issue.
Good to know. But I have heard that the embedded carbon in an EV, you need to be driving about 25,000 miles before it kind of pays off.
It's around 17,000 miles, yeah. But that's a year and a half of an average driver, I would imagine.
Yeah. But even better would be to have such great and accessible and cheap and wonderful public transport that you didn't need
True.
your own car. I need people I know who live in London. They don't have their own car. They don't need to. So if you had that kind of level of public transport that goes where you want it to go, supplemented perhaps by driving, rideshare apps and so on, that would be even better. That would be a truly sustainable solution. So if you have a personal carbon allowance that applies to travel in general, I mean, obviously flights would be a huge part of it, but it would start steering investment towards those more sustainable options. And they'd be great for especially rural communities where, if you don't have your own car, and teenagers in rural communities are stranded unless, their parents are constantly providing them with lifts and so on. So I do see a lot of potential there to create something good for society if we just start with travel. So there's a number of ways we could do it. We could start with a small country to gain credibility, or we can start with a small aspect of our, pick the most high carbon consumption sector and just focus on that, develop it from there.
Sure, and I think it would be important as well to reassure people that a scheme like this would not be punitive unless you happen to be a really high emitter of carbon. And, that's only the top X% of people, whatever that X is.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we still don't know, the data on, carbon emissions across the population is still a bit sketchy, really. We kind of base it on expenditure, which Yeah, you can match it with carbon emissions, but only up to a point.
Hmm.
But I think what we do know is that there's a sort of tail of high emitters. And so most people are somewhat below average, or a bit below average, because the mean is high because there's these kind of high emitters. And let's say we bring this policy in this, or whenever it is, people's emission allowances would be going down every year as we head towards net zero. And what moves around then is the price of a carbon allowance. And if most people are reducing their emissions, then that actually should stay quite low. I mean, if it's sky high, then that's sort of a bad sign. It means most people aren't investing in efficiency, or not giving up that extra flight, or the city hasn't made bus journeys available, or whatever it is that's not enabling people to live lower carbon lifestyles. So you would kind of hope, if we do it right, the price doesn't become the only driver. Actually, it's that sort of, what's my fair share? What's my neighbour doing? What information have I got? What nice low carbon options have I got? Actually, I don't really want to use the car. I'll use my e-bike instead, or maybe I'll actually not take that journey and I'll, Skype into my meeting. So, it's got to be part of a transformation. If nobody was interested in living a low carbon life, obviously it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Right? It wouldn't work. If nobody was able to live that sort of life, it wouldn't work.
It needs a certain amount of peer pressure as well, I got to think. I was talking to a Norwegian guy last week, and he was saying that, now the sales of EVs in Norway is in excess of 90% of new car sales. And he said if somebody does buy a new car and it's not an EV, they're kind of looked at askance, and it's similar to, lighting up a cigarette in a hospital room, it's or on a plane, it's or in a restaurant, people kind of go, you didn't buy an EV? Why? It's irresponsible almost. So I think we've got to have something, a similar kind of transformation of people's mindset for something like this to take place, or to make something like this successful, no?
In some ways, maybe you need less peer pressure because there's a personal incentive. So at the moment, the only reason I wouldn't fly to Maldives, while eating steak on the journey, it's my own personal green conscience. But also there's an element of people being judgy. Yeah.
Right.
But I would feel much better about it if I was being rewarded for my good behaviour. It's not very nice going around being judgy or guilty or resentful. Much better to actually align your personal incentives with the desired behaviour. So I would think if I'm rewarded for not behaving that way, or rewarded for my walking trip to the Lake District, then I might feel less bad about the fact that other people are doing that. Because at the moment I'm thinking, well, they're all having fun because they don't care. And now I can think, well, they're paying for the nose for it, so haha.
I mean, I think it's very interesting the way Denise is focusing on sort of, emotions and things like that, because of course there's a sort of, I don't know, an energy policy academic, I'm sort of thinking about, the carbon emissions per kilowatt hour and the sort of, the techie aspects of it. But of course this is, it is about collective action, is about social norms, as well as it's about prices, as well as it's about getting feedback on your behaviors. And so there's all sorts of things going on. I think one thing that's so I mean, this seems like an aside, but if we think about, for example, smart meters, for example, when smart meters came in, if you have an in-home display, what the research shows is, without giving people any additional advice, they can sustain energy savings of about 3% a year over time, and they may even increase over time, right? And that's just the power of actually getting feedback on your behaviour, of understanding a bit better the energy use in your home. I mean, you can do things to help people make much more savings than that based on that data, and better advice. But just even the feedback of having a carbon allowance and going, oh right, I'm 3 times the national average, am I? I mean, that does matter. That just even that step, even if there was no penalty, right? Even if you introduced this as an information measure and you didn't straight away start talking about what happens if you exceed your cap, which is, I think, in reality what you'd do. First, it would come in as information, and then we'd say, and from next year or the year after, actually, we're going to start meaning it. And if you exceed your cap after that, you give people maybe a learning year where they can work out where they are. and what options are available to them, and then you start applying a penalty, I think. So you can see it as a source of, you know, hope, a source of information, a source of, you know, encouragement to make the right sort of changes, rather than just some sort of penalty and a big stick that we're going to hit people with.
But
That
also, don't
sounds
forget,
again
you
very
make
much like
money, don't you, from going under it?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
there's carrots as well as sticks. So while I'm cycling up the hill to work, instead of seething at my colleague who's flying down from Edinburgh every day, I could be sending in some of my carbon credits.
Yeah, I mean,
It sounds very much like how the EU ETS scheme started out, where companies were given far more allowances than they needed. And so, you know, it took time for the cap to come down and come down and come down for it to be effective. But in the meantime, they were getting used to the system and getting used to reporting to it and getting used to buying and selling. And now it's become an effective mechanism and it's reducing emissions. I think something like a gigaton has come out of the system now as a consequence of the EU ETS scheme, and they're reducing it. At the moment, it's 2% a year, but they're ramping up for the Fit for 55 to over 4% a year now. So I do see parallels there, and I think you're right. I think it would have to be brought in a phased manner rather than an overnight boom. No more carbon for you, Mister.
yeah, but I think hopefully you'd want it to get effective faster than the EU ETS, because I think
Absolutely.
it's reasonable to say the first 10 years of that scheme were a bit debatable about how much positive change that really drove. But then hopefully we've learned from that
Yeah.
we can move in faster. Because I think the other thing about this scheme is, if it works, right, if it's helping us to get towards net zero, it'll only, you know, what will it be in for 20 years? And then we won't need it anymore, more or less, 20 something years. I mean,
Yeah.
after that, hopefully, you know, we're living in some sort of net zero economy where we've completely decarbonized the energy system. We're doing all the, you know, other stuff around land management and peat and, you know, all the other type elements of greenhouse gas emissions. And maybe, you know, this is a transition tool to help us all get to where we need to get to.
I like
Don't
the
know.
idea as well that it will enable economies of scale for low carbon products. So at the moment, I put my hand in my pocket to pay twice what I would do to get insect-based dog food. That's me mentioning it earlier, but it is a big expense. You know, I've got two dogs, so if we're all doing that, if that's rewarded, you know, if that comes out of our carbon allowance, you know, these companies that produce it can really take off, and then it will become cheaper, and it will just become easier and easier to live a low carbon lifestyle.
Yeah.
Fair point. Fair point. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
Well, I mean, I was just going to talk a little bit about the research that's been done on this, particularly the research around, well, what do people think of it? Because actually, it's one of those ideas that you can explain it to somebody in 2 minutes, and then they can start having an argument with you very quickly, as I know from talking to students and talking to public groups about it. It's quite easy to grasp the idea and what's really at stake, which makes it fascinating for discussions, really. But there's been quite a lot of research on different groups in different countries, and people always come back to two issues with this idea. There's the one is the fairness, and the other is the implementation. And I think we've covered that a lot in the podcast. And those are the two things people are concerned about. And if they think it's fair, and if they think it could be done practically, then they tend to be in favour. And if they think it's unfair, or they don't really believe you could have a policy like this, they tend to be against it. So that's where we need to make the argument and make the case with people. If it's going to get public acceptance and if it's going to get political acceptance, those are the things that we need to focus on, because that's that's how they engage with this idea.
One issue, though, is avoids the issue of vested interests. So you may think it's fair, but if it doesn't benefit you personally, if you are a very high carbon lifestyle person, then you're going to have those people bad mouthing it and spreading misinformation. And, you know, their reach sometimes is disproportionately loud because
They own social networks.
they own social networks. They want to go to the moon, for God's sake. We're talking about traveling to Maldives. So this is something that I think we need to be prepared for as well. It's just that the trash talking is spreading of misinformation, because clearly it is fair. I think that argument's been made, and it can be implemented. It's just a question of how. So it's tackling those other voices, which are just really protecting their own high carbon lifestyles.
Fair.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And again, the research would back you up on that. People with higher emissions tend to be a bit more skeptical about it than people with lower emissions. Obviously, it's self-interest. But I mean, I think another encouraging thing is it's not particularly a left-right thing. So you've got people on the right and people on the left supporting this as an idea, because people can find different values in it, right? They can find it reflecting their values in different ways. And I think that's quite encouraging. This isn't only an idea for the sort of red-green type people. It's an idea that can work for everybody, and I think that's really important.
Cool, great, superb. Tina, Denise, if people would like to know more about yourselves or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Tina?
That's a good question. There isn't one place, but I think we've got a very nice little short YouTube animated video, and if you look for personal carbon allowances Fawcett on YouTube, you should find that, and that's quite a nice sort of 3-minute introduction to the idea.
Cool. Send me the link to that and I'll include it in the show notes, Tina.
Will do.
Denise?
Well, my website, which has got my books which talk about that, is dabaden.com, just one word, Da Baden. And also you will find a lot of stuff on this on greenstories.org.uk. And you will also find Tina's work there as well, because we reference that in our book, No More Fairy Tales, Stories to Save the Planet. Each solution in there links to a page on the website where there's more information to learn more about it. So personal carbon are covered there as well.
Perfect. Awesome. Tina, Denise, that's been great. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.